All right, think about this for a second. At the start of the 1900s, the world map was dominated by these massive, ancient empires. I mean, they'd been around for centuries. But then in just 20 short years, everything changed. That old world, it just came crashing down. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into exactly how that happened. Yeah, it's pretty wild. We're going to focus on how three of these huge land-based empires, we're talking the Russian, the Chinese, and the Ottoman empires, basically fell apart all at once. And at the same time, you've got this powerful authoritarian state in Mexico just imploding. I mean, their collapse completely reshaped the world we live in today.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll set the stage, what the world looked like on the brink. Then, we'll dive into the unique stories of Russia, China, the Ottoman Empire, and Mexico. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at what kind of new world order rose from all that chaos.
All right, section 1, the world on the brink. A century of change begins. So you got to understand, at the turn of the century, these old land-based powers were under some serious pressure. I mean, immense pressure. They were desperately trying to modernize, but at the same time, they were dealing with all this unrest at home. Plus, they were facing this insane competition from the new industrial powers in the West. This was the perfect storm, really, the backdrop for their collapse and the birth of a whole new set of countries.
Okay, first up, Russia's Red Dawn, the fall of the Tsar. Let's dig into how this absolutely massive agricultural empire, an empire that stretched across 2 whole continents, was pushed right to its breaking point.
So Russia's collapse, it's really the story of a perfect storm. Let's break it down. From the inside, you've got this huge, really impoverished peasant class and just growing, bubbling political anger. And then from the outside, Russia gets hit with this totally humiliating naval defeat by Japan in 1905. That just shattered the whole myth of Russian military power. And then you pile on the catastrophic losses from World War I, and the Tsar's credibility, it was just gone.
And man, when things started to go wrong, they went wrong fast. Look at this timeline. That 1905 revolution, that was a massive warning shot. Then in 1914, Russia gets dragged into World War I, and just 3 years later, poof, the Tsar is gone and the Bolsheviks are running the show. I mean, that is an incredibly rapid fall from power.
So, who were the guys who stepped in to fill that power vacuum? The Bolsheviks. This was a radical political party led by none other than Vladimir Lenin, and they saw all this chaos not as a disaster, but as their golden opportunity. They were ready to sweep away the old regime and build something completely new.
And how did they do it? Well, a lot of their power came down to this one simple but absolutely brilliant slogan: peace, land, bread. Think about it. Peace for the soldiers who were so done with the war. Land for the peasants who had nothing. And bread for the starving workers in the cities. It was genius. It captured everything people wanted. And it's what paved the way for the world's very first socialist state.
Okay, next up, China's last dynasty falls. The end of imperial rule. And what's so fascinating here is that a very similar story of internal rot and external pressure was playing out halfway across the world, bringing down China's last imperial dynasty, the Qing.
So, just like in Russia, the Qing dynasty was basically rotting from the inside out. You had this deep-seated ethnic tension between the rulers, the Manchu minority, and the Han majority. Now you add widespread famine and a super corrupt government into that mix, and you've got a powder keg just waiting to explode. And from the outside, well, they just couldn't keep pace with industrializing Europe, and that exposed just how weak they'd become.
So into this power vacuum steps a man named Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and he comes along with a totally modern vision for China. He wanted to get rid of the whole emperor system and replace it with a republic, one built on his 3 principles: nationalism, democracy, and what he called the people's livelihood.
All right, on to our third case study, the Ottoman Empire's end. You might have heard it called the sick man of Europe. This was a once mighty empire. I mean, it lasted for centuries. But by 1900, it was just struggling. It was desperately trying to survive in a world that was modernizing way too fast for it.
So, this group called the Young Turks comes to power, and they have this big idea to save the empire by modernizing it. Their plan was something called Turkification. Basically, their goal was to create one single unified Turkish identity. But here's the problem. The Ottoman Empire was huge and super diverse. So this policy, it just ended up alienating all the non-Turkish people, like the Arabs and Armenians. So ironically, the very thing they thought would save the empire actually helped tear it apart. And then, came World War I. That was the final nail in the coffin. They sided with Germany, they lost, and the victorious Allies just carved up their empire. It was over. But out of those ashes, a new story began. A nationalist leader, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, led a fierce war of independence, and from the rubble, he forged a brand new, modern, sovereign nation, the Republic of Turkey.
Okay, for our final case study, we're heading to Mexico for a fight for land and liberty. Now, this one's a little different. The revolution here wasn't against some ancient, crumbling empire. Nope. This was a fight against a modern authoritarian regime that had funneled pretty much all the power and all the wealth into the hands of a tiny elite.
And if you want to know what the core issue was, it was land. It all came down to land. Under the dictator Porfirio Diaz, a tiny elite owned pretty much everything. Meanwhile, the vast majority of peasants had nothing. This chart really shows you just how extreme that inequality was, and that is what fueled the whole revolution.
But getting rid of the dictator didn't just bring instant peace. Far from it. It actually kicked off a brutal decade of civil war. It was a chaotic free-for-all, with power shifting violently from one faction to another. It wasn't until a new constitution was adopted in 1917, and then eventually a single political party, the PRI, was formed, that Mexico finally got some real stability.
And this conflict produced some absolutely legendary figures. You had Francisco Madero. He was the political idealist who kind of got the whole thing started. Then up in the north, you had the charismatic and totally unpredictable General Pancho Villa. And down south, Emiliano Zapata became this huge icon. His famous call for Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, perfectly captured what the peasants were fighting for.
All right, Section 6, a new global order, the aftermath. So we've just seen 4 really powerful states basically crumble in a super short amount of time. So what's the big takeaway here? What does their collapse all at the same time really mean?
Well, the bottom line is this. These were not isolated events. Not at all. They were all part of this massive global shift. The old model, the sprawling, land-based empire, it just couldn't survive anymore. It couldn't handle the pressure from within, the competition from without, and all these radical new ideas. The writing was on the wall. The era of the nation-state was here.
All of these revolutions promised to give power to the people. But the question is, what new powers did they end up unleashing on the world? Because the fall of these empires, it did a lot more than just draw some new lines on a map. It set the stage for the huge ideological battles that defined the entire 20th century. We're talking communism, nationalism, democracy. Their collapse left this massive power vacuum, and that unleashed forces that would shape the next 100 years of conflict. It leaves us with a really complex and often violent legacy to think about.